The ship was called the Throne of Iridescence, and it was the most beautiful thing Commander Cale Marin had ever seen. It stretched across the void of space like a living jewel, its hull shimmering with colors that had no name in any human language. It was the royal cruiser of the Valanthi sovereignty, home to Queen Selithra and her court, and it made every human warship look like a tin can floating in a bathtub. Cale stood at his assigned post near the outer ring of the royal quarters and tried not to feel small. He failed. He was one of 6 human soldiers sent aboard as part of a diplomatic exchange. The politicians back on Earth had called it a historic gesture of interspecies cooperation. The soldiers who actually had to live it called it what it was, a dog and pony show. Humanity had only been part of the Galactic Concord for 11 years. They were the new kids, the small fish, the species that every other race in the galaxy looked at with something between pity and amusement. The Valanthi had agreed to take a handful of human guards aboard their royal ship as a sign of goodwill. In return, humanity got better trade deals on fuel and medical technology. It was a fair exchange, if you didn't mind being the thing that got exchanged. The Valanthi were tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed about them. They stood almost 8 feet high, with lean bodies covered in fine, iridescent feathers that shifted color with their moods. Their eyes were large and dark, like polished stones, and behind those eyes lived minds that could touch other minds, psionics. Every Valanthi had it to some degree. They could sense emotions, project thoughts, and in the case of the royal bloodline, do things that made human scientists weep with frustration because the physics simply should not work. A Valanthi could be 400 years old and still be considered in the prime of life. They looked at humans the way humans might look at a dog that had learned to do math. Impressed, perhaps, but never as equals. Cale had been called a mayfly 14 times in his first week aboard. He had stopped counting after that. The Valanthi guards were the worst. They were the elite of the elite, trained since childhood in both combat and psionic warfare. They moved through the ship like they owned it, because in a very real sense, they did. When they passed Cale at his post, they did not look at him. When they spoke about him, they did not lower their voices. "The mayfly is still standing there," one of them said to another on Cale's 3rd day. "Do you think it knows what it is guarding? It knows how to stand. That is enough for a creature with its lifespan." Cale said nothing. He stood his post, watched his sector, and kept his mouth shut. He was a soldier. He had been a soldier for 18 years, since he was 17 years old, and angry at a world that had not been kind to him. He had fought in 3 conflicts on Earth and 2 off-world skirmishes that the politicians pretended never happened. He had scars on his body that told stories he never shared. He knew how to take an insult. More importantly, he knew how to take an insult and still do his job. And his job right now was to guard the outer corridor leading to the quarters of Princess Aelindra, the Queen's youngest daughter. He had seen her only twice. She was small for a Valanthi, barely 7 feet, with feathers that shimmered between soft gold and pale violet. She was 42 years old, which by Valanthi standards made her something like a teenager. She had her mother's dark eyes, but none of her mother's hardness. She looked at the world with a curiosity that reminded Cale of his younger sister, back when his younger sister had still been alive. On his 2nd week, she spoke to him. "You are the human," she said, stopping in the corridor as if she had just noticed him for the first time. Her voice was musical, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "Yes, Your Highness," Cale said. "You live for less than 100 years. If we are lucky, yes." She tilted her head, her feathers shifting to a deep blue that Cale had learned meant thoughtfulness. "What does it feel like, to know that you will end so soon?" It was not a cruel question. There was no mockery in her voice, only genuine wonder. the kind that came from someone who had never once considered their own death as something real and close. "It feels like a reason to pay attention," he said. She stared at him for a long time after that, and then she walked away without another word. But she came back. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She asked him about Earth, about oceans and mountains and cities made of glass and steel. She asked him about war, and he told her things he probably should not have told a princess. She asked him about death, and he told her about friends he had buried, about the weight of a folded flag, about the sound a mother makes when she opens her front door and sees two soldiers in dress uniform standing on her porch. She listened to all of it with those dark, ancient eyes, and Kale realized that for perhaps the first time in her sheltered life, someone was telling her the truth about what the universe actually cost. While the princess asked her questions, Kale kept doing his real job. He watched. He noticed things. He noticed that the patrol rotations on Deck 7 had a gap of 90 seconds every 4 hours. He noticed that the sensor grid near the aft cargo bays had a blind spot large enough to hide a shuttle. He noticed a pattern of encrypted subspace signals pinging the ship every 6 hours from somewhere inside Volanthi space itself. The signals were short, tight, and used a frequency that the ship's main communication array was not scanning. He filed a detailed report and submitted it through proper channels to the Volanthi security commander, a towering warrior named Rethik, who had once referred to Kale as the pet. Rethik did not respond. The report disappeared into nothing. Kale filed a second report, then a third. Nothing. 2 days later, the ship docked at a neutral space station for a diplomatic meeting. Kale stood at his post near the docking ring and watched the cargo shuttles come and go. It was unmarked, which was unusual, and it docked at a bay that was supposed to be reserved for maintenance vehicles. He pulled up his scanner, a basic human model, nothing compared to Volanthi tech, but good enough. The reading came back, and his blood went cold. Phyxar compound, a bioagent engineered at the molecular level to attack Volanthi royal DNA. It was one of the most classified substances in the sovereignty. It should not exist outside a military research lab. It certainly should not be sitting in an unmarked shuttle 30 meters from the princess. Kale broke protocol. He went directly to Rethik and told him what he had found. Rethik looked down at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You scanned a diplomatic vessel with a human toy," he said. "Go back to your post, Mayfly, and do not waste my time again." He stood there, alone in the corridor, and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like a stone. Something terrible was about to happen aboard this ship. He was the only one who knew, and nobody would listen to the Mayfly. The attack came 3 days later, in the dead space between star systems, where no help could reach them. Kale was asleep when the first explosion shook the ship. He was on his feet before the second one hit, pulling on his boots and grabbing his sidearm from the locker beside his bunk. The other human soldiers in the barracks were doing the same, their faces tight with the calm focus that came from years of training. They did not panic. Humans who had survived real combat never panicked. They just moved faster. The ship's lights flickered and died. Emergency red replaced them, painting everything the color of old blood. Then came a sound that Kale had never heard before, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth and made his vision blur for half a second. "Psionic pulse," said Corporal Diaz, the youngest of the human team. Her face was pale. "They're hitting the communication arrays." The Volanthi used psionic technology for their long-range communications, a system that no outside force should have been able to disrupt. But these were not outsiders. These were Volanthi. The separatists, military hardliners who believed the Queen was weakening the sovereignty by making deals with lesser species, had finally made their move. Kale grabbed his combat knife and headed for the door. "Diaz, Torres, secure the human quarters. Everyone else, with me." "Where are we going?" asked Sergeant Okafor. "The princess." They made it 2 corridors before the psionic assault began in full. It hit like a wave of invisible fire. The separatists were broadcasting on Valanthi psionic frequencies, jamming, confusing, and overwhelming every mind that could receive them. In the corridors around Kale, Valanthi guards stumbled and fell. Some clutched their heads and screamed. Others turned on each other, unable to tell friend from enemy through the storm of false signals flooding their minds. A guard Kale had spoken to just that morning drew his weapon and fired at the wall, convinced he was seeing an attacker that did not exist. But Kale felt nothing. His mind was silent, quiet, dark. The dull mind that the Valanthi had mocked for weeks was now the only mind on the ship that the separatists could not touch. He was blind to psionics, deaf to the frequencies they were using, and completely, perfectly clear. He ran. The ship was chaos. Bodies lay in corridors, some dead, some unconscious, some curled into balls and whimpering as the psionic assault tore through their minds. Kale stepped over them, around them, through them. He shot 2 separatists on Deck 5. He broke the arm of a third on the stairs between Deck 5 and Deck 4. Sergeant Okafor went down on Deck 4, hit by a plasma bolt that took his leg below the knee. Kale dragged him behind a bulkhead, applied a tourniquet, and kept moving. He reached the royal quarters alone. The door to Elindra's chamber was sealed, a heavy blast door designed to withstand a direct torpedo hit. But the environmental systems were not sealed. Kale could see the readings on the corridor panel. The Fixar compound was in the ventilation system, flowing through the ducts like poison through veins. It was already inside the princess's room. He tried the emergency comm panel, dead. He tried his own radio, static. He slammed his fist against the blast door hard enough to split his knuckle open, and then he did the only thing a human could do in that situation. He thought. The maintenance access panel was 3 meters to his left. He ripped it open with his knife, crawled into the duct, and wriggled through 20 meters of narrow metal tunnel in the dark, following the sound of coughing. He found her on the floor of her chamber. She was on her hands and knees, her golden feathers fading to a sickly gray. The Fixar compound was invisible, odorless to humans, but to Valanthi royalty, it was death itself. It was attacking her from the inside, breaking down the unique proteins in her blood that marked her as a member of the ruling house. "Commander," she gasped, and there was fear in her voice, the real, raw, animal fear of a young woman who understood she was dying. Kale did not hesitate. He pulled the rebreather unit from his own suit, the only thing keeping the Fixar from reaching his lungs, and sealed it over her face. The fit was wrong. Human equipment on a Valanthi face. He used strips from his own uniform to strap it in place, working fast, working with hands that did not shake, because he would not let them shake. "Breathe," he told her. "Just breathe. But you?" "I said breathe." She was taller than him, heavier than him, but he lifted her anyway, because the alternative was leaving her here to die, and that was not something Kale Marin was built to do. He carried her to the maintenance duct and realized it was too narrow for both of them. So he went back to the blast door, and with the princess barely conscious on his shoulder, he manually overrode the locking mechanism, using a technique he had learned on a human warship 6 years ago. It took him 4 minutes. The Fixar compound was in his lungs for all 4 of those minutes. He could feel it. Not the way a Valanthi would feel it. It was not designed to kill him. But it burned. It burned like breathing glass, like fire that had learned to crawl. His vision blurred. He coughed, and what came out was red. The blast door opened. He stepped into the corridor and started walking. 3 decks. He had to cross 3 decks to reach the emergency shuttle bay. 3 decks of compromised ship, filled with separatists and psionic chaos, and a poison that was eating him alive from the inside. He made it halfway before the Separatist commander found them. The Volanthi was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, armored in black, with feathers that burned a deep and terrible red. He stood at the end of the corridor and raised one hand, and Kale felt the world change. Terror. Pure, perfect, absolute terror. It slammed into the corridor like a physical force, a psionic projection so powerful that it dropped every living thing in range. Behind Kale, 2 Volanthi Marines who had been trying to retake the corridor collapsed, sobbing. Alindra screamed against the rebreather, her body convulsing as the projected fear tore through her already weakened mind. He felt the cold fingers of it reach for him, searching for the fear centers of his brain, trying to find the place where his courage lived so it could crush it. It found nothing it could hold. Not because Kale was not afraid. He was terrified. He was bleeding from his mouth. His lungs were on fire. He was carrying a dying girl through a ship full of killers. And he knew, with the cold certainty that only a soldier understands, that he was probably not going to survive this. But human fear did not work the way Volanthi fear worked. It was not a frequency that could be jammed. It was not a signal that could be amplified. It was a feeling, deep and old and personal, and Kale had carried it with him every day of his life. He knew his fear. He had shaken hands with it. He had learned, long ago, that the only thing fear could not survive was a man who kept walking. So he walked. The Separatist commander stared. His psionic projection was strong enough to disable a squad of trained Volanthi warriors, and this small, bleeding, soft-skinned creature was walking through it like it was nothing more than a cold wind. Kale closed the distance in 7 steps. He did not use his gun. He did not use his knife. He put Alindra down gently, and then he beat the Separatist commander unconscious with his bare hands. He picked the princess back up. He walked the rest of the way to the shuttle bay. He placed her inside the emergency shuttle, programmed the autopilot for the nearest Allied vessel, and sealed the hatch. She pressed her hand against the glass. Her eyes were wide and wet, and full of something he did not have time to name. "Thank you," she whispered through the rebreather. Kale smiled. It hurt his face. It hurt his chest. Everything hurt. "Tell your mother I said hello," he said. He pressed the launch button. The shuttle fired into the black. He watched it go. Then his knees gave out, and the floor came up to meet him like an old friend. He was still breathing when the Volanthi Marines found him 6 hours later, but only barely. His lungs were scarred, his nervous system was degrading, and by every medical standard humans had, he was a dead man walking. They put him in a medical pod that glowed with light and hummed with energy that his species would not understand for another century. He floated in warm nothing and dreamed of earth and rain and the sound of his sister laughing in a kitchen that no longer existed. When he opened his eyes, Queen Selithra was standing over him. She was the most powerful being he had ever been in the presence of. Her feathers were deep silver, her eyes were black as the space between stars, and her face held an expression that he could not read. She looked at him for a long time. "So," she said quietly, "you are the Mayfly." Kale spent 9 days in the Volanthi medical pod. During that time, machines that should not have existed worked on his body with a patience and precision that no human surgeon could match. They rebuilt the tissue in his lungs, cell by cell. They repaired the nerve damage in his spine that the Fixar compound had left behind. They fixed things inside him that had been broken long before the attack. Old injuries from old wars that he had simply learned to live with. When he finally stood on his own 2 feet, he felt better than he had in years. His body was still human, still fragile by Volanthi standards, but it was whole in a way it had not been since he was a young man. The Volanthi medical chief, A tall female with feathers the color of winter sky stood by the pod and watched him take his first steps with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something close to disbelief. Your species should not have survived that exposure. The Thixar compound is designed to destroy Volanthi at the genetic level. On a human body, it simply destroys everything else. Your lungs, your nervous system, your liver and kidneys, all of it was failing when they brought you in. But you fixed it, Kale said. I used royal-grade regeneration therapy, medicine reserved for the Queen's own bloodline. She paused. The medical council objected. They said it was a waste of resources to spend such treatment on a species that will die of old age in a few decades anyway. What did the Queen say? The doctor's feathers shifted to a pale gold. Amusement, Kale had learned. The Queen said that anyone who objected again would be free to find employment elsewhere. He was given clean clothes, Volanthi made, adjusted for his smaller frame, and escorted through corridors that he remembered only as a blur of blood and emergency lighting. The scars of the attack were gone, covered over by Volanthi engineering that could heal a starship the way their medicine had healed his body. But the scars on the crew were still visible. Guards who had once walked with easy confidence now moved in tight pairs, their eyes scanning every shadow. The psionic communication arrays had been rebuilt with new encryption, but the trust that had been broken was not so easily replaced. The separatists had been caught. 47 of them, all members of the military who had sworn oaths to protect the very people they tried to murder. They were being held in secure cells deep in the ship, waiting for trial. Their leader, the commander Kale had beaten with his bare hands, had not spoken a word since his capture. But the political damage was enormous. The Volanthi sovereignty was shaken to its core. For a civilization that prided itself on unity, on the unbreakable bond between ruler and ruled, the betrayal was almost unthinkable. And worse than the betrayal itself was the fact that had become impossible to ignore. When the crisis came, it was not a Volanthi who had saved the princess. It was a human, a mayfly, a creature they had treated like a clever pet. Some Volanthi were grateful. They stopped Kale in corridors to touch his hand, a Volanthi gesture of deep respect, and spoke words of thanks in voices thick with emotion. Others could not look at him. The shame was too great. A few openly hated him for it, because his heroism was a mirror that showed them their own failure. And no one enjoys looking into a mirror like that. Kale ignored all of it. He wanted to go home. On the 10th day, he was summoned to the throne room. It was a vast space, a cathedral of light and crystal that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. The ceiling was open to the stars, or at least appeared to be. Volanthi technology made it impossible to tell where the ship ended and the universe began. Hundreds of courtiers stood in concentric circles around a raised platform where the Queen's throne sat like a piece of captured starlight. Kale walked through the crowd in his borrowed clothes, feeling every pair of dark alien eyes on his skin. He was the smallest person in the room by at least 2 feet. He kept his back straight and his eyes forward. Queen Selithra sat on her throne and watched him approach. She was ancient, over 600 years old, but she wore her age the way a mountain wears snow. Her silver feathers caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. Her eyes held the weight of centuries. Beside her stood Princess Aelindra. She was pale, her feathers still tinged with the gray of her recovery, but she was alive and standing. When she saw Kale, her feathers flushed deep violet. She did not speak. Kale stopped at the base of the platform and waited. Humans had agreed to many things in their treaty with the Volanthi, but bowing was not one of them. The Queen spoke. Her voice filled the chamber without effort, layered with psionic harmonics that made every word feel like it landed directly in the center of Kale's chest. Commander Kale Marin of Earth, you are given the lowest post in my guard. You were ignored when you raised warnings. You were dismissed, insulted, and treated as something less than what you are. She paused. And when the darkness came, you were the only light that did not go out. The court was silent. Kale said nothing. My daughter lives because of you. My bloodline continues because a human, a species my own people call mayflies, chose to stop breathing so that she could keep breathing. I do not have words sufficient to name what that means. But I have law. She stood. The entire court shifted, a ripple of surprise passing through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Queens did not stand for anyone. I invoke the dead of sheltered blood, she said, and the silence that followed was so complete that Kale could hear his own heartbeat. This is the oldest law of our people. It says that when a life is saved at the cost of one's own, the rescuer and the rescued are bound. The rescuer is taken into the house of the one they saved. They are given name, standing, and purpose. They are family. The word hit the court like a physical blow. Kale could see feathers changing color across the room. Shock, outrage, confusion, and 1,000 shades of disbelief. I name Commander Kale Marin as guardian bonded of House Saleth. He will be granted full standing in my court, full protection under my law, and full access to the resources of my house, including medical care that will extend and preserve his life for as long as it is within our power to do so. Voices rose from every direction. Objections, questions, demands for explanation. One noble, a tall male with feathers as black as coal, pushed forward through the crowd and pointed at Kale with a hand that trembled with anger. This is madness. He is not Volanthi. He is not even a proper sentient by our standards. You would give this creature, standing in the royal house? The queen looked at him. Just looked. The noble took a step back as if she had struck him. I would, she said, and I have. Kale found his voice. Your Majesty, I am grateful, but I was doing my job. I don't need titles or standing. I would like to go home. The queen turned her dark eyes on him, and for the first time, he saw something in them that was not regal authority or ancient wisdom. It was grief. Quiet, personal grief. You are dying, Commander, she said, and her voice was softer now, meant for him alone, even though every ear in the room could hear it. The Thixar compound has been removed from your body, but the damage to your nervous system is progressive. Human medicine cannot stop it. In 6 months, perhaps less, you will lose motor function. In a year, your organs will begin to fail. Your people cannot save you. She descended the steps of the platform until she stood directly in front of him. She was nearly 3 feet taller. She looked down at him with those impossible eyes. I can save you. My doctors can maintain your body, slow the degeneration, and give you decades that your own species cannot. But only if you stay, only if you are here where my medicine can reach you. She placed one long, elegant hand on his shoulder. It was warm. Her feathers shimmered with a color he had never seen before, something between gold and white, like sunrise on snow. I will not allow the man who bled for my daughter to die choking in some human field hospital, she said. That is not a request. Kale looked up at her. He looked at Elindra, who was watching him with eyes full of something he could not name. He looked at the court, hundreds of alien faces staring at him with every emotion the galaxy had to offer. He was a soldier from a small planet with a short life. He did not belong here. Everything he knew was telling him to leave. But the queen was right about one thing. He was dying, and she was offering him time. All right, he said quietly. I'll stay. From the back of the throne room, The black-feathered noble watched with cold, calculating eyes. He had already begun to plan. The challenge came 6 weeks later, at a formal court gathering where Kale was still learning which fork to use and which direction to face when the queen entered a room. The black-feathered noble was called Lord Virenthor, and he was old, even by Valanthi standards, nearly 500 years, with a military record that stretched back further than most human nations had existed. He had commanded fleets, won wars, and served 3 generations of the royal family. He believed with every fiber of his ancient body that the queen had lost her mind. He stood in the center of the court, his dark feathers catching the light like chips of obsidian, and he spoke the words that everyone had been thinking. The human is not worthy. He performed a single act of physical courage, admirable perhaps for his kind. But a guardian bonded is not a guard dog. It is a member of the royal house. It must prove that it possesses not only the will to fight, but the mind to endure, the body to persevere, and the heart to serve. I invoke the trial of worth. The court fell silent. The trial of worth was ancient, older than the current dynasty, a ritual from a time when the Valanthi had been a warrior people, and every title was earned in blood. It had not been invoked in over 200 years. It was designed for Valanthi, beings with centuries of experience, bodies built for endurance, and minds sharpened by psionic training. No human had ever faced it. No human was ever meant to. Kale stood in his borrowed clothes and looked at the queen. She sat on her throne with her hands folded and her face completely still. She did not speak. She did not intervene. She simply watched him with those dark, ancient eyes, and he understood. This was a test, not from Virenthor, from her. She needed to know if he could survive in her world. She needed the court to see it for themselves, and she needed him to choose it freely. I accept, Kale said. The trial began the next morning. The first test was called the mind. In the old language of the Valanthi, it was something closer to the drowning of self, a psionic labyrinth constructed by the court's most powerful telepaths. A Valanthi entering the labyrinth would face a maze of mental challenges, puzzles that tested logic, willpower, and psionic control. Kale had no psionics. The labyrinth could not touch his mind the way it was designed to. So it did the only thing it could do with a human brain. It went looking for pain. They put him in a dark room and connected sensors to his temples. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was somewhere else. He was standing in a kitchen, his sister's kitchen, the one with the yellow curtains and the crack in the ceiling that she always meant to fix. She was there, standing at the stove, humming a song he had not heard in 15 years. She turned and smiled at him, and his heart broke so cleanly that he could feel the edges. She had been dead for 12 years. A car accident on a rainy Tuesday. He had been deployed on the other side of the world when it happened. He did not make it home in time. Stay, she said. Stay here with me. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But this was not real, and he knew it, and the knowing was the cruelest part. I can't, he said. The kitchen dissolved. He was in a field hospital, holding the hand of a soldier named Reeves, who was 19 years old, and bleeding out from a wound that no medic could fix. Reeves was asking for his mother. Kale told him she was on her way. It was a lie. Reeves died, believing it. He was in a room where a commanding officer told him that the mission he had led had been based on bad intelligence, and the 3 soldiers he lost had died for nothing. He was in a bar at 2 in the morning, drunk and alone, looking at his hands and wondering what they were for. He was in 100 places he had tried to forget, living 100 moments that had carved themselves into his bones. The Valanthi telepaths expected him to break within minutes. A Valanthi mind, assaulted by this kind of targeted emotional trauma without psionic defenses, would shatter like glass. Kale endured for 11 hours. When they pulled him out, he was shaking. His face was wet, but he was conscious, coherent, and standing. The chief telepath, a female who had been performing the mind trial for over a century, approached him with feathers pale with shock. "How?" she asked. Kale wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Those memories have been living in my head for years," he said. "You didn't show me anything new. You just made me sit with old friends." The second test was called the body. They put him in a fighting ring with 3 Volanthi warriors. They were young, strong, and trained in a martial art that combined physical combat with psionic strikes. Each one was faster than Kale, taller than Kale, stronger than Kale, and capable of hitting him with bursts of psychic force that felt like being slapped by an invisible hand. He lost. He lost badly and quickly and completely. The first warrior put him down in 30 seconds with a strike to the chest that cracked 2 of his ribs. Kale hit the ground, tasted blood, and got up. The second warrior dislocated his shoulder with a joint lock that would have made a human martial arts instructor wince. Kale screamed, popped the shoulder back in himself with a move that made half the audience flinch, and got up. The third warrior hit him with a psionic blast that dropped him to his knees. Kale got up. He got up 17 times. The warriors hit him with everything they had, and every single time he went down, he got back up. His face was a mask of blood. One of his eyes was swollen shut. He could barely breathe through his broken ribs, and he kept getting up. The crowd had gone quiet. They had come to watch a mayfly be humbled. Instead, they were watching something they did not have a word for. A creature that was clearly beaten, clearly outmatched, clearly in agony, and absolutely, stubbornly, impossibly refusing to stay down. One of the warriors, the youngest, a male with bright green feathers, stepped back after the 15th time Kale stood up, and looked at the judges with open distress. "I do not wish to kill him." The judges ended the match. Kale had lost every exchange. He had not landed a single meaningful blow. But the trial of the body did not measure victory. It measured the refusal to surrender. And by that measure, Kale had not merely passed. He had set a standard that the Volanthi would remember for centuries. The young green-feathered warrior found Kale afterward, while the medical team was patching his ribs. He knelt beside the human, a gesture of profound respect among Volanthi warriors, and spoke quietly. "Fighting you was like fighting a creature that has forgotten it is allowed to die," he said. Kale, through split and swollen lips, managed something like a smile. "We haven't forgotten. We just don't think it's a good enough reason to stop." The third test was called the heart. The Volanthi constructed an elaborate scenario using psionic projection and holographic technology. Kale was placed in a simulation where a ship was burning, and he had to choose: save himself through an open airlock, or seal the airlock and reroute life support to save the crew, dying in the process. Kale looked at the simulation. He looked at the judges. He looked at the open airlock and the control panel, and the countdown timer that was ticking towards 0. "This isn't a test," he said. "I already made this choice. On this ship, 3 months ago. The answer doesn't change." He walked to the control panel and sealed the airlock. The simulation ended. The court was silent for a very long time. Lord Viranthor rose from his seat. He was old and proud, and had spent 5 centuries believing that his people were the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced. He walked to where Kale stood, bloody, battered, exhausted, and still on his feet, and he bowed. The deep bow of a warrior to another warrior. "I was wrong," he said. "You are worthy." That night, after the ceremony that formally confirmed his title, the Queen summoned Kale to her private chambers. She poured him a drink, something amber and warm that tasted like honey and starlight, and she told him the truth. "The separatist threat is not over," she said. "The 47 we captured were foot soldiers. The real conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of my government. I have intelligence that suggests a second attack is being planned. Larger, better organized, and aimed not just at my family, but at the relationship between our peoples. She set down her glass and looked at him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. I need someone I can trust absolutely. Someone who cannot be psionically compromised, controlled, or manipulated. Someone who has proven that their loyalty is not a performance. She paused. I need you, Kale. Not as a symbol, as a weapon. Kale met her gaze. I'll do it, he said. But on my terms. I'm not a pet, and I'm not a tool. I'm a soldier. You want my loyalty, you earn it the way humans earn it, by being worth following. The queen looked at him, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. It transformed her face. For one brief moment, she was not a queen or a centuries-old ruler. She was simply a person, amused and impressed by the sheer audacity of a creature who would bargain with a queen. Agreed, she said. Kale began his investigation the next day. It took him 2 weeks to find the first thread. It took him another week to follow it to a place that turned his stomach. The separatists had a weapon. It was not Velanthi technology. It was human. A neural disruptor, reverse-engineered from captured human soldiers, modified to work on psionic minds. It should not exist. It could not exist unless someone on the human side had provided the technology. Kale sat alone in his quarters, staring at the data on his screen, and felt the ground shift under his feet. The threat was not just inside the Velanthi sovereignty. It was inside humanity too. Someone was feeding the fire from both sides, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The truth, when Kale finally uncovered all of it, was worse than he had imagined. A shadow faction inside Earth's military intelligence, a group that called themselves the Iron Doctrine, had been working with the Velanthi separatists for years. The arrangement was simple and terrible. The humans gave the separatists weapons technology, biological data, and intelligence on human diplomatic movements. In return, the separatists shared stolen Velanthi psionic research, the kind of research that could give humanity an edge over every other species in the galaxy. Both groups wanted the same future. The separatists wanted Velanthi supremacy, a return to the old ways when lesser species knew their place. The Iron Doctrine wanted human dominance, not through diplomacy and trade deals, but through force and fear. They both agreed on one thing. The era of cooperation had to end. And the easiest way to end it was war. Kale brought his findings to the Queen on a cold evening, standing in her private study, with data tablets spread across her desk like a map of betrayal. They planned the first attack to test the waters, he told her. Aelindra was never the real target. She was the spark. If she had died, the sovereignty would have blamed humanity. Our soldiers were aboard. Our security failed. Our species was too weak to prevent it. War would have followed. The Queen's feathers had gone pale, not from fear, from anger. Now, they have something bigger. The neural weapon I found, it's finished. They've built it to full scale. It targets psionic minds. Every Velanthi on a ship, in a building, on a station. One pulse, and they all go dark. Seizures, brain death, permanent damage. And they plan to use it during the summit. The Queen had organized it herself. A historic meeting between the Velanthi sovereignty and the human coalition, to be held aboard the throne of iridescence. Leaders from both species would be present. It was supposed to be a symbol of unity. Instead, it was going to be a killing floor. If they activate the weapon during the summit, every Velanthi leader dies, Kale said. The humans present survive, because the weapon doesn't affect non-psionic minds. It looks like a human attack. War begins within hours. Both sides tear each other apart, and the people pulling the strings end up on top of whatever is left. The Queen was silent for a long time. Then she looked at him, with eyes that held 600 years of ruling an empire. Can you stop it? Not alone. She understood. For the first time in the history of two civilizations, a Velanthi queen and a human soldier sat together and planned a joint operation. No politics, just two people who refused to let the worst of their species win. The summit began 3 days later. The throne of iridescence gleamed in orbit above a neutral world, its corridors filled with the most powerful individuals from both civilizations. Human admirals in dress uniforms walked beside Volanthi nobles in ceremonial armor. Translators worked overtime. Toasts were raised, smiles were exchanged, and beneath it all, hidden in the walls of the ship, the neural weapon waited. Kale had assembled a team, 6 humans from his original attachment, soldiers he trusted with his life. 4 Volanthi warriors personally chosen by the Queen, including the young green-feathered fighter from the Trial of Worth, whose name was Talon, and who had taken to following Kale around like a very tall, very deadly shadow. And Princess Aelindra herself, who had refused to be left out. She had changed in the months since the first attack. The shy, curious girl who had asked Kale about oceans and death had become something harder and brighter. She had studied human military history, human tactics, and human stubbornness with the same focus her ancestors had used to build empires. When Kale told her the plan was dangerous, she looked at him with her mother's eyes and said, "You taught me that danger is not a reason to hide." He could not argue with that. He had, in fact, taught her exactly that. The strike team moved through the ship in 2 groups. Kale led the humans through the lower decks, heading for the weapon's power source in the engineering section. Aelindra led the Volanthi through the upper decks, using her psionic abilities to identify and isolate the conspirators hiding among the summit guests. They had exactly 40 minutes before the weapon was scheduled to activate. Kale's team hit resistance on Deck 12. Iron Doctrine operatives, human soldiers who had sold out their own species for power. Fighting them was different from fighting the separatists. These were humans. They moved like humans, thought like humans, and fought like humans. There was no psionic advantage to exploit, and no physical mismatch to overcome. It was human against human, in narrow corridors, with guns and knives, and the kind of desperate close-quarters violence that Kale had hoped he would never see again. They lost 2 people on Deck 12, a young private named Chen, and a Volanthi named Sorath who had volunteered, despite not being part of the original team. They died side by side, human and Volanthi, defending a corridor that led to the heart of the ship. Kale did not have time to mourn. He pushed forward. On the upper decks, Aelindra proved that she was her mother's daughter. She moved through the summit crowd with a grace that hid steel, psionically scanning every mind in the room. When she found the conspirators, 3 Volanthi nobles and 2 human diplomats, she did not hesitate. She locked their minds with a psionic hold so powerful that even the Queen, watching from her throne, raised an eyebrow. But it was not enough. The weapon was on a timer, and the timer was counting down. Kale reached engineering with 3 minutes to spare. The weapon was massive, a cylinder of dark metal 2 stories tall, humming with energy that made his teeth ache. It was shielded, locked, and surrounded by a final ring of separatist guards who had been told to die before letting anyone shut it down. They got their wish. Kale's team fought through them in 90 seconds of controlled violence that left the floor slick and the air heavy. But the weapon could not be shut down remotely. The conspirators had planned for that. The only way to disable it was manually, from inside the core chamber, by physically disconnecting the power conduits. The core chamber was flooded with radiation, not the gentle kind that could be treated with medicine, but the hard, killing kind that tore apart cells at the molecular level. Kale looked at the chamber door. He looked at the radiation readings on the panel. He looked at Talon, who understood what was about to happen, and whose green feathers went the color of ash. "Don't," Talon said. Kale unclipped his sidearm and handed it to the young Volanthi warrior. "Hold this for me. Commander, the radiation will..." I know what it will do. He opened the door and stepped inside. The radiation hit him like standing inside a sun. He could feel it immediately. A deep, sick warmth that meant his body was already dying. He had minutes, maybe less. He found the conduits. There were 6 of them. Thick cables of energy that pulsed with a light that hurt to look at. He disconnected them one by one, working with hands that were starting to shake, in a body that was starting to fail. His vision blurred. His nose bled. Something inside his chest made a sound that was not good. He pulled the last conduit free. The weapon died. The hum stopped. The ship was safe. Both species would survive. Kale sat down on the floor of the core chamber because his legs had stopped working. He leaned against the wall and thought about his sister's kitchen and the yellow curtains and the song she used to hum. He thought about Reeves, the kid who died asking for his mother. He thought about Alindra's face when she pressed her hand against the shuttle glass. He hoped someone would tell them he had not been afraid. They pulled him out 14 seconds before the radiation would have made recovery impossible. Valanthy medicine had saved him once before. The medical team said it could not do it again. The damage was too deep, too fundamental. His cells were coming apart. The Queen came to the medical bay. She looked at Kale lying in the pod, his body broken in ways that no technology should be able to fix. And she did something that no Valanthy queen had done in recorded history. She placed her hands on the pod and opened a full psionic link with his mind. A human mind. A dull mind. A mayfly mind that had no business connecting with a consciousness as vast and old as hers. She poured her own life energy into him. Not her psionic power, her actual life force. The deep biological energy that sustained her body across centuries. She gave him years, years off her own ancient life, fed directly into his failing cells, stabilizing them, holding them together, forcing them to heal. The medical team scrambled to support the process with their technology. Alindra stood at the door and watched, her feathers burning gold, tears running down her face. When it was over, the Queen looked 10 years older. Her silver feathers had paled. The lines on her face had deepened. She had given decades of her life to save a man who, by every standard her civilization held, was not worth the cost. When they asked her why, she straightened her back and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the ship. He taught my people that the measure of a soul is not how long it burns, but how brightly. I will not let that light go out. 3 months later, Kale stood in the throne room of the Throne of Iridescence. He wore armor, new armor, designed by Valanthy craftsmen who had studied human military aesthetics and blended them with their own traditions. It was dark and sleek and practical, with lines that were human and curves that were Valanthy, and it fit him perfectly. Humans and Valanthy stood together in the same room, not as diplomats performing unity, but as people who had bled together and survived. The conspiracy had been broken. The Iron Doctrine had been exposed and dismantled. The separatist movement had collapsed when the story spread of what the Queen had done, what she had given, to save one human life. The galaxy was watching, and the galaxy was finally paying attention to the small, short-lived, stubbornly impossible species called humanity. Kale stood at his post, beside the throne. Not behind it, not below it, but beside it, and watched the proceedings with the quiet calm of a man who had found the place where he belonged. Alindra found him during a break in the ceremony. She walked beside him to the observation window, where the stars stretched out like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked. Kale looked at her. She would outlive him by centuries, even with the Queen's gift. She was alien in every way that mattered, and familiar in every way that counted. "I was supposed to be expendable," he said. "Turns out, that's the most dangerous thing a human can be." She smiled. It was a Valanthy smile, subtle, warm, layered with colors that shifted across her feathers like sunrise. My mother says you have ruined her court forever. She says no Volanthi will ever be able to claim superiority over humans again without being laughed out of the room. Good, Kale said. They stood together at the window, human and Volanthi, watching the stars. Behind them, the queen sat on her throne and observed the two of them with ancient, knowing eyes. And for the second time in the story, she smiled.